Introducing that, we have Sander van der Waal, who is Head of Networks and Partnerships at Open Knowledge International in the Netherlands. Sander, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sander van der Waal. I actually transitioned into Head of Programs since this week. But I'm very pleased to be here and to share my thoughts on the developments around open data more broadly. It was really nice to be here today and to see all the presentations from the various challenges. I think having been in this space for about 6 years now, it's really, you can really see like a level up each year, and I think the quality of the submissions this year were really good. So it's really, I think it's an encouraging sign that open data continues to mature and be more useful and more impactful in general. So I work with an organization called Open Knowledge International, formerly known as Open Knowledge Foundation. We're an international non-profit, and we strive to open up all essential public interest information and want to see it used to create insights that drive positive change. And we build communities, tools and skills to empower individuals and organizations to use that information to create the insight. So we're coming from a civil society perspective, not so much a private sector corporate background, but we work together across these different areas as we're all striving towards very similar goals. I want to focus my keynote on 3 specific developments that we're seeing in the open government data space more generally. I'm not going to talk about specific trends like blockchain or AI or the things that people talk about these days, but these are 3 developments that I think underlie all of those sort of trends and provide a little bit of insight into how the space more generally is evolving. We see this as developments for the longer term rather than sort of the trend of the year kind of thing. So I'll focus first on infrastructure, open data infrastructure. What we've seen around open data in government in the early days, before the open data really was a thing, there were communities such as communities linked to the organization I work for, who started gathering data sets and started publishing them. Governments didn't have an open data portal yet, but data sets were sometimes released, they were shared, people asked for them, got them. Some governments had them published somewhere on the site. And what you saw is that communities started building portals where they centralized these data sets and made them available centrally. So this is an example screenshot from offene Daten, the German community that published it. I always love the Wayback Machine because you can go back and see what a site looked like years ago. So this was around 2011, and you can find data there, and it was gathered and published on a portal by the community, not by the government. Then what we saw is there was open data really became a thing. It became a policy, and governments started to publish data openly and create their own portals. We developed a tool called CCAN, which is an open source software tool that governments often use to publish data. And this is an example from the French national government. This was 2012, where they had a central open data portal, and the government took ownership of making sure that data was published and was published openly. And we saw a lot of developments of governments trying to outdo one another and make as many data sets available as possible, and trying to make sure that they had more data sets than other countries. And there was a lot of sort of central publication of the data set. But what we're also seeing in that time is that the way in which the data was published is often it was a separate agency or a separate, sometimes just one guy responsible for open data in the government, and they were responsible for gathering the data from all over the different ministries and then put it on the website. And we've seen examples of where there were a lot of manual action taking place, that people just had to within government sort of getting it from their colleagues and then publishing it on the central site. And as a result, a lot of that data was either outdated or it wasn't in very good quality, and it wasn't really used. It wasn't very impactful because it was just something that was lying around or that people tried to scratch, but people never created that data set with that open data use in mind. It was really something that was an afterthought. People just published it because they had to publish as much as possible. And it was good because in a way it helped sort of create that dialogue between those who wanted to use data and the governments who were able to publish data. But in practice, there's also a lot of data out there, which even though you can have 1,000 data sets, if only 10 data sets of those are useful, an open data policy as such doesn't have a lot of potential value, you could say. What we're starting to see now is that in the infrastructural approach, there's more integration with governments to manage their data more centrally and think more holistically about how they manage the data. And often we see this more on a local level, on city level. This is an example screenshot of the city of Amsterdam, where I happen to be based, and you can go to their site. It's data.amsterdam.nl, and what you see there is you see the open data that's available to everyone. But what you also see here is there's a login button or a link on the right-hand side of the site. If you are a civil servant and you work at the government, you can log in and you actually have access to a lot more data. Because they manage the data much more holistically, they have a way of centrally deciding what the access rights need to be and how and who can get access to the data. So open data is an integrated part of how data is managed. And that's a development that we're seeing across other governments on a national level. There's a lot more investment often needed to think about data management in that way. But that's the direction that we're seeing, and it's really crucial because it means thinking about open data as an integral part of how the data is managed, not as an afterthought as it was originally, where people were trying to get data wherever it got, but really thinking about data management and the infrastructure that goes with it. So that's one sort of key development around open data. The second one I want to focus in on is standards. Because standards are really crucial as a way of ensuring that the data is valuable for the users. And we know from experience working with data can be really hard. What you see here is the data pipeline, which is used by our training program, School of Data. If you are an end user and you want to use data, there's all these steps that you need to go through. You need to define the data that you're looking for. You have to find it somewhere, get it, download it, verify it, possibly clean it because data is still quite dirty in some areas, analyze it and publish the results. A lot of these steps have friction in them. It's not easy to get all of this done. And this is something that we're still seeing and that we'll continue to see for a very long time. But standards can really help in this process. So what you see here is an example from the Open Data Institute that have a lot of focus on data standardization, and we collaborate closely with them. And there's all the different things that you can think of when standardizing your approach. For us at Open Knowledge International, we have an initiative called Frictionless Data, which is trying to make that whole data pipeline process easier by using the same lightweight standards across all of these different steps. So you don't have to use all kinds of different tools, but you use the same underlying specification for everything that you do. And the kind of things that you see here that you can standardize range from how you collect the data to the file format, taxonomies, identifiers, data transfer. All of these elements can help, if standardized, to make it easier to work with data, and that will increase the impact longer term. So on the one hand, you see that those developments of standardization on a more fundamental level. On the other hand, there's the emergence of standards on a more domain-specific level. And this is really where a lot of new value can be created, and there's a lot of opportunity also for, in the European context, to make sure that the standards that are being used across the EU are the same. Let me give two quick examples. So there's an example, this was a tweet from yesterday, where someone was asking, we're in Belgium, so I thought I'd pick a Belgium example. You can see that it's probably not readable, but I'll read it out. The English translation is, hi, do Open Knowledge Belgium know what the best data is for electric charging poles? So these charging stations that you would have in the street. There's one with an API, but it's very incomplete. There's a different site which has all of the data, but it doesn't have an API. And if you want to integrate that kind of data in your application, you're interested in that, you really need a standardized approach. You need a standard API that you can just access the data, make sure it's as complete as possible. As a reply to this tweet, someone was saying OpenStreetMap has some of that data, but it's not really complete, and we'd welcome your input. And maybe in some of these cases, there's actually a role for member states to make sure that this kind of data, which could be very relevant moving forward, is published under a standardized API across all different member states of the EU. And then application developments and companies can integrate that data into their applications. As an example of how, from the government side, you can do this is this example from Washington, D.C., which is around the dockless bikes. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept these days. You don't have the docks where you put your bike into, but because of our technological advances, you can just leave your bike anywhere, but you still have to figure out where that bike is if you want to rent a bike. So this is for rental bikes. What Washington did recently is they had a pilot with different suppliers who wanted to set up these dockless bike rental systems in Washington, D.C. And what the description for the permit said, and again I'll read it out because it's probably hard to read, is the permit holder shall provide a publicly accessible API that shows at a minimum the current location of any dockless sharing vehicle available for rental at all times, which includes the type of vehicle. Data must be in the general bike share feed specification format. So there's a very specific standard for this kind of data, but by standardizing it in this way as a requirement for the permit, they ensure that any company who wants to do this will provide the data in the kind of specification that is standardized, so that you as an end user, whether you're a company trying to create an app for this or whether you're just an interested citizen wanting to build your own app, that you have the certainty that that data will be provided in this standardized format. So this is an interesting example which is fairly recent and which we hope will be replicated across other sectors, because it's a kind of approach that will help ensure right from the beginning that the data will be available in this standardized format. So that's on standards. Then finally, governance. And with governance, I talk about all the different processes and policies that relate to the management of the data. There's actually a relationship with the infrastructure, because infrastructure is partly what needs to be managed. But by introducing this, I want to reference the Open Data Barometer, which was recently published. It was called the Leaders Edition. The Web Foundation published it, I think, 2 weeks ago now. And what they do in the Open Data Barometer, in case you're not familiar with it, they publish the state of open data in governments around the world, national governments. What they do is they look at policy, they look at implementation, and they look at impact of open data across these governments. In the Leaders Edition, as they call it, they assessed 30 national governments for this. And the 3 conclusions that they drew from their work was still fewer than 1 in 5 data sets are open. And this is 1 in 5 data sets of the key data sets that they identified that they think should be made openly available. Early world leaders, such as the UK and Canada, were faltering. They weren't. The US in particular as well. It was not. I think Canada was doing better than the US, actually. I should say. But those were early world leaders. Both the UK and the US were on the forefront in 2012 on open data policies and helped start Open Government Partnership and various initiatives around open data. But they're falling back slightly, which is a concern. But the main conclusion, which I think is relevant from the context of governance, is that open data is still treated as a side project. So despite what I said earlier around the developments in infrastructure that you see in Amsterdam, for example, there's a holistic approach towards data management. For national governments, often there is still this guy or this department on the side that has to gather all of that data and publish all of that data. And that's a concern from a governance point of view, because what you're really looking for and what we really hope we can achieve longer term is that an open approach can be embedded within government on all levels to make sure that that how data is governed is organized, and openness is an integral part of that management process. Of course, not all data must be open data. There's strong privacy regulations, of course, with the GDPR now in Europe, and there are some concerns, and developments will continue to take place around what data has to be or should be made openly available and what not. But the key point here is that the way in which that whole process is governed should be open and should be transparent and should involve other stakeholders. So this is also another point with reference to the PSI directive, for example, when we think about how public sector information in PSI terms is being made available. It's important that different stakeholders are part of that process. And that brings me to the PSI directive opportunities, because as you may know, there's now a review process around the PSI directive, and the initial proposals there are opportunities for more data to be made available, such as from public undertakings like utilities or transport. Research data that is funded publicly will have to be made openly available, hopefully, in the proposals. More access to real-time data, which also is important because that increases the value of the data. If you have real-time data available, it's timely and it will provide a lot more value to those users. And there's this idea of high-value data sets, which has also been around for a few years. Originally, I think it was the G8 Open Data Charter that defined key data sets that said across these sectors, these data sets as a minimum has to be made available as open data. And we welcome such a development on the EU level because it's an opportunity to make sure that the data sets that have the most potential impact for society are actually going to be made available. However, in the current proposal, there are some caveats around whether or not it will be open data or not. And there are certain reservations around market conditions and things like that, which means that it may not be open data. For us, that's a concern. We hope that the process around the definition of these high-value data sets can be made open, and that it's transparent who's influencing the decision around which data sets will have to be made or will be made openly available. Because in some sectors, if you talk to the big guys and the ones who the bigger players who already have the most power, it will in some cases not be in their interest to have that data made available openly, because it will open it up to competition. But we think that for the economy at broader scale, and maybe this is a nice topic also for the panel, there is an opportunity if small, medium-sized companies, for example, can be involved in that and benefit from that data infrastructure if it is made openly available. So just to wrap up, I think there are a few recommendations towards the digital single market. I think there are some opportunities here, as I referenced in the part about standards. If we have the same open standards across member states, there's a lot of opportunity for developing a real digital single market. If we have the charging stations in all different member states available under the same kind of open standard, there's an opportunity created for companies to develop business models on top of that as well. As I said, involve all the stakeholders in the process. That's really important. And mandate openness, but also make sure there's a strong privacy protection. I think it's always important to balance strong openness with strong privacy protection. In some cases, that balance does not work out quite yet, as we saw with the MEPs last week in the release of their expenses. But it's important that those concerns are balanced and are balanced appropriately. And the final point on open licensing, what we've seen in our work and how open data is licensed is that some governments use different licenses compared to each other, and data released under these different licenses are not compatible, which creates a problem if you're trying to operate on an EU level, because you cannot mix these data sets and use one license to cover all of these data sets. So we think there's again an opportunity for the EU to make sure that this is harmonized on the EU level. So that covers it from my end. Are there any questions or comments, or maybe I hand over to start the panel? Thank you very much.